My name is Alex. I used to be a dev at Yeti. Now I do more project management. A couple months ago now, I attended a workshop about writing better user stories. It was run by Alan Holub. So this is going to be a bit of a summary of that workshop. So we can just get started. So for a bit of context for anybody that's not at Yeti, thought I'd just talk about Yeti's general process first. We use a agile workflow. It allows us to iterate quickly, adapt to changes. We work in 1 week sprints. We have weekly check-in calls with our clients. We have shared Slack channels with them so that we can communicate easily and often. And I would say that when I personally am writing tickets to go into sprints, they do tend to be written in kind of a developer task-oriented manner. One of the common pitfalls that you can fall into is maybe the customer or the client has an opposing viewpoint to the person that's actually building the product. So the customer will think, I have to write all of the user stories myself because they don't know they don't have enough knowledge, they're going to build it wrong. And then you as the person building the product, you think the customer doesn't actually know what they want. They think they know what they want. We can't just build whatever they ask for, or it's going to be an awful user experience. But instead of fighting with your customer, you should work collaboratively with them. So if the customer says to you, I need this new menu item, you should ask them, why? Is there something that we can do to achieve the same result that would be better than a menu item? Trying to always be cognizant of they're asking for this thing. And at first glance, it makes sense. But is there some other simpler like implementation of their ultimate desire that you can do rather than, maybe building the nicest version of what they actually asked for. And then also, instead of doing these sprint demos, just get the product into the customer's hand, ask them to use your product. One of the things that we do sometimes struggle with is we'll be building something, we'll give demos to the client. They'll be pretty happy with what they're seeing, but we can kind of tell maybe through conversations that they haven't actually been using it themselves. And then when they finally do start to use it towards the end of the project, all of a sudden they notice all these things. Oh, actually, it'd be better if it worked this other way, or maybe we can tweak this thing. And so trying to catch that as soon as possible is going to let you save a lot of time. And by saving time, you save money. I mean, I do think that there's value in sprint demos, but definitely also think that there's value in forcing the customer to just get it in their hands and start playing with it. So tying all of that kind of together, you hear the term MVP, minimum viable product, all the time. When we start working with a new client, a lot of times we are building an MVP for them. And we do try to, pare it down as much as possible, figure out what needs to be in there. Maybe an interesting way of thinking about an MVP is that it's not version 1 of the product. And so because it's not, you should work together to strip out as many unnecessary features as possible, get the smallest version of the product into like customers' hands as fast as possible. And then you start to get feedback on that. And from that feedback, you'll figure out, are some of these features that you were thinking about building that seem necessary, maybe they're not actually necessary. So you're not developing a product at this point, you're just starting an iterative process that will eventually turn into a product. So again, this gets back to the experimental thinking. So you want to just take some kind of core concept and give it to some customers and see if this is something that they're actually interested in buying or using. Because if your core concept is wrong, then everything else is going to be wrong. One example that he provided was FreshBooks. It's this accounting system for small businesses. It's got timesheet management. It's got all of these other features in it. But if you tried to build all of that at once, that'd be take forever to actually build this product and release it. And it's a huge gamble as to did you get everything right the first time and people are in love with it? So originally, it was just a very simple system that let people manually enter an invoice, send it to customers, and that was it. But it was useful enough that people were willing to try it. So they started iterating and slowly adding features. Sometimes, your MVP does not need to be built. So for example, a lot of times people will come and they'll be like, hey, I've got a great idea for an app. I want you to make me the next Uber, but it's got this little twist to it. But then they think they want all the bells and whistles that are in Uber right now and not necessarily what Uber was initially. And then the MVP for Uber was just taxis. People wanted to get from point A to point B. They didn't have a car for whatever reason. So kind of in keeping with the theme of building something small, getting it into people's hands as fast as possible, the sort of steps that you go through is step 1, make it run. Step 2, make it right. Step 3, make it fast. Because performance is nice, but if you're making something performant that the customer doesn't actually care about, then it doesn't really matter if it's performant. And if it's not running in the first place, then you'll have no way of knowing if it's actually providing value to the customer. So some of the ways that you can streamline this whole process are through continuous integration. You just push your changes, they immediately get deployed. And so it lets you kind of go through that whole feedback loop very quickly versus if you're just doing manual deploys and you say, okay, every 2 weeks, for example, you're going to be pushing changes out. That's a much slower feedback loop. You have to wait 2 weeks, then you push them out, then you have to wait to get customer feedback. Then you start to think about how to implement changes if you got negative feedback. It obviously, it takes much longer amount of time. But if you're doing continuous integration, you're just constantly pushing changes out, something might break. So you need the confidence to know that these changes that you're pushing out are not going to break, which is where testing comes in. So ideally you have automated tests and you also have normal testing, QA, sort of you push out to a smaller subset of users first and get feedback from them before releasing it to the entire environment. Test-driven development is another thing that can give you confidence that you're pushing your changes safely. If you start with test first and then write your code. A lot of this kind of getting to this sort of perfect loop can be aspirational, but identify where you want to be and incrementally move towards that point. And so then going back to making this tight feedback loop is the concept of just simplicity and sort of making sure that you're always building something simple. Because once you start getting to more complex things, that's going to blow up your timeline, more chances for things to go wrong. So build simple first, refactor, and slowly add that complexity in later. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. I guess a bit of an aside on the Agile Manifesto, I think like maybe the most important quote is our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So specifically, like the word valuable is kind of a big focus of Alan's approach to user stories. So valuable in this case means valuable to customers. And value doesn't have to be a big thing. People often get wrapped up in that. They think that you have to provide some big value to your customers, but it actually just has to be a little bit more useful than whatever existed before. And then cumulatively, if you're making these small valuable changes, eventually you've made a big value add. What does value to our customers mean? It means that customers can get more done than they could before. If you start to think in terms of broader notions of value to the company, value to developers, you lose track of the customer's needs. An example of this would be maybe the devs want to try out some cool new tool. They're like, oh, this is really awesome. It'll, make things faster or whatever. But it might not actually make the customer's life any better. So in that case, it's not actually providing any value to the customer. So it doesn't belong as a user story. Keeping the system running is also not the customer's problem. That's your problem. So when you're writing user stories specifically, you shouldn't write user stories to implement a fix to your problem. You should write a fix to implement what the customer needs. What does this mean for writing stories? So instead of writing a large 3-point, 5-point ticket solving a big problem, break it down into multiple smaller tickets, solving smaller problems to achieve the same final goal. At Yeti, we try not to do 5-point tickets. We always try to break those down. We do occasionally, though, have 3-point tickets, which I think in this kind of approach, 3 points is too big. We'll talk about it a little bit later. According to Alan, the idea of points at all is misguided, but breaking down these tickets into smaller parts has the added benefit of exposing potentially unnecessary functionality that could be dropped or backlogged in favor of higher priority tasks. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but the more that you break it down, the more granular that you can get with your user stories, the more chance it is that you'll find something small here and there that can be dropped, which will then allow you to get faster version of what you really want to be releasing to your customer into their hands and get more feedback as far as what's actually going to help them. Speaking of estimates being a waste of time, they're bound to be inaccurate because we're constantly changing and adapting. If we're going to be making releases every day or two, the progress is going to be visible to everyone. So estimates even lose their value as a measure, I should say, of progress. So, if you're telling your client, we usually get X amount of points done each sprint, and then they might just get into the habit of counting up how many points are done, and that's how they feel like progress is going to be made. But if you're constantly releasing updates, then the progress is visible because they can just go to the website and they'll see these changes have constantly been implemented. So instead of worrying about are we on time or have we hit this milestone, instead just be asking, do we have something working in the customer's hands? And you'll just constantly be releasing something working into the customer's hands, slowly getting better and better. So instead of worrying about points at all, if you're keeping your stories small, you can just be concerned about an average throughput of stories, because you do want to know, is this project on track? Things like that. That is still valuable. But instead of spending time worrying about these abstract notions of points, which are supposed to be kind of nebulous and not really mean anything anyway, but people tend to kind of shortcut into X amount of points is Y amount of hours. Instead of worrying about that, just worry about overall, how many stories are we getting through? Because they should all be small stories, approximately the same complexity. Some stories might take a bit longer or might go a bit faster, but that should balance out over time. So if your throughput is low, lower than expected, maybe the stories are still too big, too complex. So break them into smaller stories and throw out the less critical ones. Speaking of user stories, one of the most common ways of writing them is this Connextra template. We've tried using it a few times at Yeti. I think it never really stuck. To me, it feels like just a bunch of extra writing, but it's usually as a role, I need to do some type of work so that I can achieve some type of goal. As a user, I need to log into my dashboard so that I can see how many orders have been placed today, I guess would be an example of a user story. And then it'd be like, okay, well, I need to go and either build the dashboard to begin with, or on the dashboard, I need to show how many orders have been placed today. The problem with this is you can shoehorn anything into this template. And it's very easy to just, instead of the customer user's role, you could say, well, as a developer, I need to do this thing, or as a, I don't know, an admin, I need to do this thing. But again, these are supposed to be user stories. They're supposed to be focused on your user and providing value to your user. So these would not, according to Alan, again, be valid user stories. So instead, how should you approach them? You shouldn't think of them as random bits of work. They should describe your user's work and focus on value to the user. So it should be a short narrative on describing user performing a domain process that results in a valuable outcome. So domain process is something that your user is going to be doing, not something unrelated to their domain. So that's not, if it's not, then it's probably not providing them with value. And then you should, as you're writing your stories, try to keep details out and undecided as long as possible, because again, we're constantly iterating, we're constantly making changes. So if you spend a bunch of time writing additional details into your user stories, there's a good chance that by the time you actually get to that user story, something's changed. Now you've got out-of-date comments, out-of-date details. Maybe your implementation is now going to be different. So any of this detail work that you put into the backlog has a good chance of ending up being a waste of time, being forgotten about. This has definitely happened to me before, where I'll write a bunch of tickets, put them in the backlog, and then a week later, something's changed, and now all those tickets are a little bit out of date. Something's not quite right about them. And it's like, well, do I delete them? Do I go back and edit them to try and update them? Do I just write new ones? And it's just, it ends up taking even more time. So these big stories also, they can hide low value tasks. So this is something that we talked about previously, but breaking the story up into smaller tasks during sprint planning, put the highest value tasks into the sprint and then put the rest in the backlog. So this is something that we do try to do to some extent at Yeti. I do think that I tend to have more high-level tickets, and I'll talk with the devs. We'll break them into smaller tasks. But the part about identifying the highest value ones, putting the rest into the backlog, is something that I think we could start to consider more. And so then you'll add the details just before implementation to avoid chances of spending that time thinking about the details, writing them out, and then something changes and now it's going to work differently. And so you want to take these big stories and reduce their scope so that you're accomplishing less than sort of in that big story initially, but you're still accomplishing something of value. And so one approach to reducing the scope is kind of taking these branching paths and splitting each one into its own story. So if in one situation you do X and in another situation you do Y, then that's two different user stories right there. So you would make two different tickets in the sprint to reflect that work. And then you want to replace general statements with specific statements. So for example, if you're writing a task for an admin user and you want the admin user to be able to manage regular users' accounts, but so then you're thinking, okay, like the admin user needs to be able to change the user's name, email, address, whatever, phone number. But it turns out that actually, maybe the only thing the admin actually needs to be able to do is change the address that these products are being sent to. So you don't need to build out this whole complicated form. You just need one field, change the address, and a button to submit that. So that's a way you could, for example, reduce a lot of scope in that task. And so then speaking of the backlog, right, we just said, try and take these stories, break them down into smaller tasks, and then anything that's not important, throw into the backlog. Very easy then for the backlog to quickly become bloated. And one of the things that I struggle with is managing the backlog, finding time to go in and you've lost context of something that you've thrown in the backlog 2 months ago. Maybe you don't really know what's going on. Maybe it's already been fixed from some other change that got pushed. So, and you just end up with this very bloated backlog. So The backlog should be 1 month maximum. I think, again, this kind of depends on your own personal circumstances. And once you reach sort of that limit that you've imposed upon yourself for your backlog, if you want to add a new ticket to the backlog, then you need to remove something else. And this is by imposing this rule on yourself and sticking to it, you'll just kind of naturally be managing it, and it'll make you think a bit more about what you're throwing in there instead of just kind of dragging everything in. But also, keeping stories high level is going to make it easier to adapt to these changing circumstances. If you're throwing a bunch of detailed tickets into the backlog, also that's going to eat up your backlog space really quickly. And so obviously, one of the things we've been talking about, these user stories and how they shouldn't reflect dev work, but dev work is still going to need to get done. So essentially, you're going to want two backlogs. You're going to want a product backlog, and then you're going to want a sprint or technical backlog. And so the product backlog should always be things that the end user is going to find valuable. And then you can still have your sprint technical backlog to contain those technical issues like database updates, package updates, things like that. But by splitting them out, I think you'll be more cognizant of, is this sprint that we're working on now, is it more heavily weighted towards the sprint and technical backlog? Maybe this sprint is not providing much value to the user. Is that actually something that we're okay with doing? And so then you've got these user stories, or you want to start making them. And one of the problems with Jira is it's just kind of like a spreadsheet, essentially, just a vertical list of a whole bunch of stories, and not necessarily organized in a great way if you want to be thinking about timelines and task complexity and things like that. So instead, using a sticky board, whiteboard with stickies on it literally, or a tool like Miro, which lets you put virtual stickies up, is better. So if a story can't fit on a sticky note, it's too big or too detailed, I think this is one case where Miro might not be great, because it just automatically adjusts your font, so you can put as much text on there as you want. So I guess just being a little cognizant of that. But when you're writing your story on your sticky note, you should be asking who, what, and why. And don't worry about how, because we might change our minds about the how. The how comes right before implementation, as I said before. So you can organize them in a horizontal timeline. So in order to do X, you have to do Y and then Z. And then you can vertically add additional details or variations. And then you can order them vertically also by priority. And so because the sticky notes are easy to just pick up and put back down, it's very easy to keep in a constant state of refinement. You just pull off a new sticky, pull off an old sticky, put up a new sticky. You could have a rule: if you want to put a sticky on, then you have to take another sticky off. And whereas like a tool like Jira can obscure a lot of this, and a sticky board can make it very easy to visualize. So what Alan said is that in his office, he always has a large monitor with the Miro board up at all times, so that everybody can constantly be looking at it. And the timeline, the priority order of tasks is just constantly visible to everybody and constantly in your thoughts. And so he had this INVEST acronym as a way to approach writing these stories. So independent, instead of relying on complicated tools, is there a way to do a simple version that'll fulfill what you wanted from that tool that you're going to be adding first? Is it negotiable or collaborative? Everybody should be talking together. Is there a way to change the scope, reduce it to get the product out faster? Is it valuable? to the end user? Is it essential to the end user? If you, in other words, if you don't do it, then the product is not going to work. They should be as small as possible. And then in order for you to have confidence for that whole feedback loop, the story should be testable. Because if you can't trust your code, then you have to spend more time making sure that nothing's broken. And so then in order to, another approach to sort of taking these larger user stories and narrowing them down now into smaller ones that you can then begin to implement is to start removing variation. So find the hardest, most complicated part first, identify the variation in it, replace the variables with constants, and now you have one story. And you can change those constants to some other constants, and you have a second story. You can repeat this, and it'll often allow you to strip out fluff, like maybe there was fancy UI that you were thinking you would need, but once you've kind of gone through these iterations, you find you don't need it anymore. Maybe you don't need a database because it turns out you only have a small set number of variables, and there's no need for the database. There's also going to be business rule variations. For example, dates. Instead of having a complicated date picker, maybe you just let the user pick, a variation on a day of the week, plus or minus 1 week. So every Monday, and then you can add a week or subtract a week, or any dates between X and Y, which again, now you don't need to have. I mean, there's plenty of date pickers out there now that you quickly add to a project, but as an example. And then similarly, data variation or search. Maybe you've got a search and you're like, oh, we need to let the user search by SKU number or product name or product type, all these different factors that you think the user is going to want to be searching on. But it might turn out that actually all your customers are only just searching by the product name. So in those cases, it might be better, right, to just start out with a very simple literal search of the product name and release that first. And then if users say, hey, I want to be able to search for this other thing, then you can go and you can add that after they've asked for it. So as far as planning, now you've made this sticky board, you've got your stories, so then what? So you should be working on the most important thing at all times, which you should be able to visualize through that sticky board. And then the question won't be, when's the product going to be done? It's going to be, how do we meet this next strategic objective, this next sticky in our timeline? Again, you want to be keeping the backlog as short as possible, and you want to constantly be identifying value. So if the company can't afford to do something, then it's not valuable. You don't need to do it. If you have to do it, then the work is going to take as long as it takes, and you shouldn't be really worrying that much about the timeline. You should always be working on the most valuable thing next. And so then kind of, again, going into all of that, making sure that you're working on the most valuable thing, making sure that you're writing these simple stories, keeping these stories, again, valuable, small. You think about workflow isolation. So if you have this user story, to keep the discussion civil and relevant, authors need to be able to review and approve comments on, let's say, their blog platform. So from this statement, it kind of sounds like you're going to want a dashboard flow where you can review comments and then approve or reject them as necessary. But once we start to break that down, in order for there to be comments that can be reviewed in the first place, right? Somebody needs to be able to create a comment. It gets added to the comment thread, and then the comment gets displayed, right? That's going to be the first step. So we've taken this larger story and broken it down to kind of the first thing that needs to happen. And so then from there, now we start worrying about approval. So you create the comment gets added to the thread, and you email the blog owner and you're like, hey, here's this comment. Do you want to approve it or reject it? Or maybe not even reject, you don't even need it, right? So if they give approval to the comment, then you display the comment, and that's another workflow. And then, so again, I was just saying you need to be able to reject it, but actually you don't, right? The more simple implementation would just be if they don't reply for X number of days, whatever you're comfortable with, then you delete the comment. And so let's say that's the flow that you implement. X amount of weeks pass, no customers have complained or requested a dashboard to manage them because this sort of email flow is working well enough, then there's actually no need for a dashboard. You just saved yourself a ton of time. I think we could all agree that just sending out an email and having one button that you click to approve a comment and publish it is going to be a lot faster than creating a whole dashboard where you can view all of the comments and approve or disapprove them, or then you're going to start to think maybe we should be able to edit it, right? It becomes much more complicated, much quicker, very quickly. So final thoughts and my review of the workshop is, again, I feel like we try to do this, but just staying cognizant of working with our customers to make a small MVP, really drilling down into like what's the core problem that they're trying to solve, and making sure that we're not throwing in any of these extra bells and whistles. I guess it's not here, but making sure that it's in their hand and that they're actively using it, testing it, and giving us feedback on how it feels. I think we could do more of this sticky road mapping with stories. I started doing this with one of our clients. I think it's really helped. It's really helped me kind of visualize things and understand the product deeper. And I think it helps the client also to have a more of an idea of what our timeline is going to be. Since if we just throw these things into Jira or ClickUp, again, it's like very easy for that to become kind of bloated and hard to understand like exactly how things are going to be going. I'm very interested in the idea of making these stories as small as possible and potentially just doing away with the idea of points. I think there's a lot of places where it could help us at Yeti if we didn't have to worry about points and we were just focused on these small user stories, smaller tasks, and completing them, and just using the story throughput as kind of our measure of progress. And then again, another one that to me is very interesting is the smaller backlog, constant maintenance of the backlog. I mentioned it earlier, but I definitely struggle with doing this backlog maintenance. So having a strict rule about we're only allowed so many stories in our backlog. If we want to put something in, we throw something out. I think it just makes everything a lot easier and is going to allow us to stay more focused on providing value to our customers.